Welcome to this series of videos about the restoration of vintage drums from my personal collection. In this episode, we're looking at a Prussian-style snare drum that dates back to 1892. This drum was sold by the Max Meyer Brothers company in Omaha, Nebraska. Not only were they instrument dealers, but they were also jewelers. You might not be thinking that that makes a lot of sense, but it really does, because jewelers often were responsible for clock windings, and the keys for clocks happen to be the same kind of keys that were also used in drum tensioning. Sometimes with the vintage drums that I own, I'm lucky enough to find out something about the owner, and I have that information here. Written on the bottom head is John Albert Copeland's name and the date December 25, 1892. That helps me to date the age of the drum. It coincides with the date that the Max Meyer Brothers store was open in Omaha. This is a Prussian-style snare drum, and by Prussian-style, I don't mean it was made in Prussia. It was named after the end of the Prussian War. The word Prussian implied strength and power, and that's exactly what you want in a musical instrument. You want something that's going to last. So let's talk about the tensioning system on this snare drum. This is a single rod tension drum, which means when you turn the tension rod, both heads tighten at the same time. This drum was invented at a time before self-aligning lugs were designed. It's a little bit tricky to try to get them in the right place. It takes a little bit of practice. These Prussian-style snare drum tension rods have a different sort of key, a larger key than typical drum sets today. This drum has only 7 lugs, which is typical for drums of that time, although 6 lugs and 8 lugs were also common. The claw design that was a part of the tensioning system was often handcrafted, sometimes hand-hammered by someone with a blacksmithing forge, and sometimes cast. But the claws were tapped to receive the threading of the tension rod by hand, and so some of them are off-center, some of them are a little bit crooked, some of them are too close to the edge and might bust, but it all works. The counter hoops had faux finishes on them and sometimes resembled mahogany, rosewood, or other types of popular woods. Both of the heads need to be replaced, and the gut snares will also be replaced, as well as the leather butt plate. The snare drum strainer design was simple but effective. A couple of interesting features about this drum are the wooden grommet, the maple veneer, the sling hook, and the leg rest. The sling hook and the leg rest can be engaged or disengaged depending on whether you are using this drum to march or using this drum in an orchestral setting. This drum was constructed at a time when snare drum stands were not readily available. In fact, it would be a few years before a standardized snare drum stand would even be invented. And that's the reason the leg rest and the hook are permanently a part of this drum. For this restoration, I needed a few supplies: a batter head, a snare head, gut snares, and a leather butt plate. As with many drums of this age, it's not manufactured to the same standards as today. It's 13 1/2 inches in diameter, which means a custom drum head had to be created. One of the challenges is my inexperience in tucking my own calfskin heads. I had some lessons, but it's still a trick. It's not something that you do every day, and these needed to be a custom size. In that process of tucking my own heads, I first needed to order the heads and then soak them. Once they were soaked and totally pliable, I wrapped each drum head, the batter head, and the snare head around the respective flesh hoops. And while the new drum heads are still wet, they need to be formed onto the drum so that a collar can be created. This can be really tricky and hard to get the tension rods back onto the drum, so I've used some clamps to help me get the drum heads close enough that I can put the tension rods back on. The next morning after changing the heads were still damp, but they were doing good. I waited one more day and the heads were dry and it sounded playable. The next step was to replace the snares. For this process, the gut snares need to be soaked for about 20 minutes and threaded through the leather butt plate. Once the gut is threaded through the butt plate, that entire snare assembly is threaded through a space in the counter hoop, over the snare bed, and across the snare drum head to the snare strainer on the opposite side. Then those are carefully threaded through the strainer, and the strainer is tightened. Once they're secured in the strainer, you need to wait another day so that the gut can dry out. So with everything in place, I'll let you decide for yourself how it sounds. Well, I think it sounds pretty good, and I hope you agree. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the flip side. This activity is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the East Central Regional Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.